Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. Our topic for today's webinar is Implications of Scheduled Solar ITC Reversion for RPS Compliance. And this webinar is a presentation of the State-Federal RPS Collaborative. The RPS Collaborative is a project of the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA, and our host for this webinar is Warren Leon. Warren is the Executive Director of CESA. And before I pass it over to him, I would like to go over just a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our participants today are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of our webinar. You can use your computer's mic and speakers, or you can dial in using your telephone. And very importantly, we ask that all of our audience members please type in your questions as you think of them throughout the webinar. You can type them into the questions box on your webinar console and hit send. So please type those in as you think of them, and don't wait till the end. We'll be reading through your questions as they come in, and we'll have a Q&A at the end of our presentation today, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. So type those in as you think of them. And finally, this webinar is being recorded. You will find a recording of this webinar as well as all of our previous CESA webinars on our website at cesa.org/webinars. And we'll also email you a copy of that after the webinar today. And with that, I'd like to pass it over to Warren Leon.
Hi, thank you very much, Samantha. I first want to let you know that this webinar is organized by the Clean Energy States Alliance for the RPS Collaborative. CESA is a national coalition of leading public agencies from across the country, mostly state agencies, but also municipal, that are working to advance clean energy in this country. And one of the things we do as an organization, if you can go to the next slide, is to manage the state-federal RPS Collaborative. And we do this on behalf of the U.S. Department of Energy and the Energy Foundation. The RPS Collaborative includes state RPS administrators, federal agency representatives, and a wide range of the stakeholders. Anybody who's interested in RPSs is welcome to participate in our activities. And the RPS Collaborative seeks to advance dialogue and learning and interchange about the challenges and solutions related to RPS administration. You can sign up for the RPS Collaborative listserv and get monthly newsletters from us and learn about upcoming events. Just go to the CESA website and look for the page for the State-Federal RPS Collaborative. If we go on to the next slide, today we're very pleased to have with us Jenny Heeter, who's an energy analyst at the National Renewable Energy Lab. Jenny wears several hats in this regard. Our work for the Department of Energy is supervised by the National Renewable Energy Lab, and Jenny plays the role of being our liaison to the project, and so she's actively involved in the RPS Collaborative, but she also wrote the paper we're going to be hearing about today. And before I introduce the paper, I do want to let you know that Jenny, in addition to working with the RPS Collaborative, focuses her research on corporate investments in renewable energy, in the green power market, and renewable energy certificate markets, in net metering policies, and utility regulatory issues. She's also done a lot of work at the intersection of policy with solar deployment. Before working for the National Renewable Energy Lab, she worked at the Indiana Office of Utility Consumer Counselor, which is the ratepayer advocate in that state. She holds an MPA degree in environmental policy from Indiana University Bloomington, and she holds a BA in environmental studies and political science from Macalester College. And most important for us today, if we can go to this next slide, she's lead author on the paper we're going to hear about, which is implications of the scheduled federal investment tax credit reversion for renewable portfolio standard solar carve-out compliance. The title's a mouthful, but it's an important paper for folks who are interested in RPS policy, because there's been a lot of question about, well, what difference will it make if the federal investment tax credit goes away? And this paper tries to put some real numbers on that. And as Jenny is giving her presentation, as Samantha indicated, please write in your questions and I will ask them for you at the end of her presentation. And with that, let me turn it over to Jenny Heeter.
Great, thanks Warren. Thanks for having me on this webinar. And yeah, I realize the title of the report is a mouthful, but we try to spell out acronyms in our titles so that folks who are not familiar with this topic are not totally confused. So what we're looking at is the implications of the scheduled solar ITC reversion for RPS compliance. And I'm going to present the results of our paper, which you have a link to in the handout, and it's on one of the slides that Warren just showed. So if you haven't looked at the full paper, we do go into more detail about our methodology and some of the state-by-state results, and I'll be able to cover today. So I'd encourage you to take a look at the report. But what I'll cover today, wanted to just provide some background information on our scope, the current status of solar carve-outs, and also future solar alternative compliance, or SACP rates. Then we want to look at future outlook for solar carve-out compliance. We do that looking at projected capacity from two different third-party forecasts, and then we look at the additional capacity required by state to meet the solar carve-outs. So using those scenarios, we have some examples of projected future carve-out compliance. And then the last section, I'll highlight some modeled effects of the ITC reversion on PPA prices. And this work was done using NREL's System Advisor model. And again, I won't be walking through all of the details of that model, but that is a publicly available model that NREL runs and can be used for a variety of things. But we use it here to examine the ITC reversion impact on PPA prices. And actually, before we get started, too, I just want to note that we look at the impact of the commercial credit, the ITC commercial credit reversion. So there is also a residential reversion, but we're focused on the commercial reversion here, and that we decided to limit our analysis to the commercial sector for a variety of reasons, but one of them being that, that is the bulk of compliance in most states. So with that said, what we're looking at today, I wanted to just outline the scope here. So we are looking at two questions here, and behind these two questions is a way that we've narrowed our scope of which states we're looking at. We are looking at states that both have a solar carve-out as well as an ACP, a solar ACP. And we narrowed our analysis to those states because we wanted to answer the question of, if there is a reversion and projects are no longer able to be built under the ACP rate, will utilities or LSEs, compliance entities, will those folks just pay the ACP instead of buying solar? So we're trying to figure out, will compliance be met with ACPs, in which case, solar won't be developed at the rate it has been, or will the economics be able to work out? So that's our general scope of the paper. On this next slide, you'll see the map of states that we are focused on. So the states in dark blue there are the ones that we include in the report. You also see, obviously, there are other states that have a solar carve-out in light blue. Additional states have some kind of DG carve-out. And some of those states do have a cost cap provision, but it is not an ACP provision. It could be just a general cost cap on their RPS. So we did not include those states in our analysis. So when we look at solar carve-outs, this is data from 2014. We wanted to get a sense of, where are states now in terms of compliance. So you'll see a column there that has their carve-out compliance rate for 2014. And a lot of this data comes from LBNL, who has done a lot of work tracking carve-out compliance and RPS compliance over the years. So you will see that, as of 2014, most states were pretty well there. They were complying at, near 100%. One exception is New Hampshire, which is a bit of a unique market, as most markets are unique, but because of the small nature and the nature of their carve-out, they weren't quite at 100% in 2014. We also show the installed capacity in those states. So you'll see it varies quite a bit. New Hampshire was at 8 megawatts in 2014 compared to New Jersey at almost 1,500 megawatts. And I should note that these, installed capacity is changing very dramatically. So this is just from 2014, but we did include some updated numbers in the report as well. One other piece of background information that we looked at and presented in the report was regarding SACP rates or solar ACP rates. In most states, those solar ACPs are set to decline over time, which you'll see, they decline somewhat dramatically in some states, less dramatically in other states. But you'll see here the red dashed line is 2015 SREC price, and we compare that to the solar ACP over time. So you'll see, in Pennsylvania and Ohio, the 2015 SREC price is basically below or near below the solar ACP in the end year or 2020, 2025 time frame. But in DC, Maryland, and Massachusetts, you see a different story there. So one thing we're considering is, the SREC prices right now maybe need to decline over time in order for the ACP, for compliance entities to not pay the ACP. So our first section here is on capacity projections. So we wanted to understand, with the ITC reversion, what impacts are folks projecting on installed capacity. So we looked at GTM's 2015 study as well as EIA projections of the ITC reversion. They are pretty different forecasts. So in the figure there, you'll see the GTM line is the top line in blue, which basically projects a temporary reduction in installed capacity, but then a ramp up following that. So they project, overall the market will still be growing through the 2020 timeframe. EIA has, a pretty dramatic fall due to the reversion, and then has pretty slow growth, about 6% annual growth. Their projection goes out quite a bit further, but we just show through 2020 here. So these were our bookend projections. We know that it's very hard to forecast markets like these, and EIA and GTM take different approaches, but it gave us a good, high and low scenario in terms of where capacity might be falling short. And so when we overlay those two projections, you'll see the two lines in each of these state plots that are a little bit confusing, so I'll try and walk through them. But when we overlay those projections of capacity with what is needed based on the solar carve-out, there are some shortfalls in a couple markets. So these plots, you'll see the upper line, which is sort of a dark blue, is the cumulative installed capacity under a temporary ITC effect. That's the GTM study. And then the lower dashed red maroon line is the cumulative installed capacity under the permanent ITC effect, which is our EIA data. So what we're looking at is, a band of projected capacity, and then the dark sort of brown color is indicating that there is a shortfall compared to what is needed to meet the RPS solar carve-out. So, a couple of big highlights here. DC obviously could be quite short. Ohio, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, to lesser degrees. New Jersey and Massachusetts, just based on these figures, are doing pretty well in terms of meeting their carve-out. And so we wanted to look at, this basic market understanding to figure out, are states already ahead of their RPS? Are they, their RPS solar carve-out, are they, projected to meet it next year, in which case, the ITC reversion wouldn't have much impact. So this work helped us understand where states might need to be in order to meet their solar carve-out compliance. This figure is just a slightly different way of looking at the previous work, but has a little bit more granularity. So you'll see the biggest shortfalls are a little bit easier to see here relative to each other. In dark blue, DC has a shortfall throughout the period we look at. Projected shortfalls in Maryland sort of in the nearer term, and Ohio in the longer term. So overall, based on this deployment scenario analysis, we tried to figure out, how sensitive are solar carve-outs just based on these different deployment scenarios. So we sort of qualify that in the table here. Delaware, DC, and Ohio are very sensitive. Maryland and Pennsylvania are sensitive, and Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and New Jersey, we say they're pretty robust to the ITC reversion. And then we also outline sort of a summary from the previous figure about when the shortfall might occur under the permanent ITC effect. So now that we have an understanding of, the markets and where states are with compliance, we wanted to do some analysis more on the financial side to understand if there is an ITC reversion, what does that do to project economics in those states? So for this analysis, I mentioned that we used NREL's System Advisor Model, or SAM. And I'm getting a little bit of feedback on the line. Is that okay, Sam, or can you hear me okay?
It does. Yep, it sounds good.
Okay. Yeah, so for this, this section, we're looking at what is the impact of the commercial ITC reversion on PPA prices. And to do this, we had to make a number of assumptions and really think through our methodology here. So I'm going to first start with some of that detail, although it is outlined further in the report. The first is the role of state incentives that are not SRECs, but other state incentives. For example, if the state has a rebate program, or the utility has a rebate, or other type of upfront grant or something like that. So we did not consider those in this analysis, and the purpose of doing that was to present an apples-to-apples comparison. And some of the feedback that we got was that those state incentives are really uncertain. So, in 2 years, it could be that those programs no longer exist. So we wanted to model basically a worst case. We have an ITC reversion, we have no state incentive. So we use that as our forecast, and then for comparison's sake, we assume in the current year that we model that those state incentives also do not exist. So the impact that has is that in some of the figures I'll show going forward, the current state may not reflect what you're actually seeing right now in your state. If you have an RPS if you have a rebate program that's really bringing the economics to look more favorable, you won't see that reflected in the figures I'll present next. Second consideration we have is for utility rates and load profiles. The utility rates we use are, based on the state, sort of an example utility in the state. So it's obviously not considering all of the rates in that state. We do not examine shared solar, although that is becoming a more popular option in many states. But those projects do have different economics than some of the sample projects that we model here. We accounted for SREC payments in SAM. There's sort of a quirky way to do that, but the detail is in the report. So there is a way to sort of input an incentive payment into SAM and model that. And then finally, PPA calculations. So you'll see what our assumptions are on the right, that table there, and the values that we included. So we looked at a 500 kilowatt system. The installed cost was variable by state based on some market data that we have. Then we looked at assumptions for balance of system costs. So those are all of the non-hardware costs for solar. We also looked at installer and developer margin and overhead, internal rate of return or cost of capital, and have all the assumptions outlined here. So I won't bore you with all of those details, but this is sort of our primary considerations that go into SAM. So what did we do in SAM then? We, modeled our base case, but then we also looked at reductions in balance of system costs, in developer installer margins and overhead, and reductions in cost of capital. So we looked at these three things as things that could decline as developers might face an ITC reversion. They might look to reductions in these three categories, or one of them, or multiple of them. So balance of system costs, we have a lot of work at NREL and at the Department of Energy focused on, how can balance of system costs decline, because it is a large component of the overall system costs. And we know that module prices have come down a lot over the past, even 5 years, but there's more to be done in terms of reducing balance of system costs. So in our scenarios, we look at balance of system cost reductions of 12% and then of 30%. So pretty big range there. In terms of the developer and installer margin and overhead, there's been quite a bit of work understanding, what that value is currently. So it's about 30 to 38% of total installed costs. And there, folks are talking about how, corporations could become more productive. They could have tighter profit margins. A number of things that could contribute to reducing that installer margin. So for our scenarios, we looked at a 10 cent per watt reduction and a 20 cent per watt reduction. And then the final reduction category that we modeled was the cost of capital. So currently, tax equity returns are about 8 to 10% and constitute about half of total project cost. But when we have, or if we have an ITC reversion, there will be fewer tax credits generated by solar projects, which means that tax equity players won't be making as big of an investment, so the overall weighted cost of capital could be reduced. So what we wanted to look at in this category was a high cost of 50 basis points reduction and a low cost of 100 basis point reduction. So those are our cost reduction categories and our high and low benchmarks for how those costs could be reduced. Great. So this last section, I wanted to present some of the statewide results. So I'm just going to walk through state by state what the SAM modeling, the System Advisor model, showed when we ran a bunch of these scenarios. And before going into all the statewide results, I want to just walk through what these plots look like. So you'll see the first bar on the left is the cost under a 30% ITC, so that's sort of what we have now. And then the next one is under a 10% ITC, so under the reversion, just based on all assumptions being the same, no added reductions that I just mentioned, so the cost you'll see goes up. And then the plots or the bars after that look at, if we had a 12% reduction and balance the system costs, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself, what increment would that decrease the project cost to if we had a 10 cents per watt reduction in developer margin, that incremental reduction, and then a 50 basis point reduction in cost of capital. So that's all for our for one scenario, and then similarly on the right-hand side are other assumptions there. So and then the red lines show sort of a band of electricity rates, so your rates that you're paying right now in that state. And for that, we looked at basically a rate that has no demand charges and a rate that has demand charges. So it's a little bit confusing to know sometimes how much solar might decrease demand charges or if it will at all. So we present a band there for electricity rates. So with that outline of what these plots look like, hopefully it's not too confusing if this is the first time you're seeing it. But what we're seeing in Maryland, currently is that project economics are pretty tight. But we are seeing projects being built. So we know that under the 30% ITC, we're sort of right in the middle there. Some projects are viable, some might not be. And then in both the high and the low installed cost scenarios, so the left-hand and right-hand figure, we see that the project costs are not within what we call our competitiveness range. So we see that there is a gap there between the electricity price and our final cost, even under these high and low cost installed cost scenarios. So we do see that there is a gap here in Maryland, but we found that if we modeled an SREC price in the future, that competitive PPAs could exist under an SREC price of about $200. And that's not entirely inconsistent with what we've seen in the market, but it is in out years higher than the solar ACP in Maryland. So that's sort of the snapshot of Maryland. Moving on to Massachusetts, the market here, we see pretty clear difference between Maryland and Massachusetts. So in Massachusetts, your electricity rates are substantially higher, so that band up at the top there is in the 20-cent range. When we look at scenarios under the 30% ITC, which is our current scenario, you're well below that electricity price band. Projections in Massachusetts that we looked at in the previous section showed that Massachusetts is well on its way to meeting its solar carve-out, and you can see that under both the high and low installed cost scenarios, that Massachusetts should be able to continue to install solar based on these economics. That said, there have been changes in the incentive programs in Massachusetts, and every state has a lot of regulatory uncertainty sometimes when these markets are shifting. So we would never want to say that one state is a slam dunk over another, but the project economics in Massachusetts are pretty favorable. So moving on to New Hampshire, you'll see that under the current 30% ITC, the projects are higher than the electricity rates. So that led us to think, well, what's happening here? We know that there are projects being installed in New Hampshire, but based on this analysis alone, it looks like that would not be favorable, or competitive. And this is one state where not including the state rebates makes a dramatic difference in these plots. So in New Hampshire, they have a capacity-based rebate that's pretty generous, 65 cents per watt for systems larger than 100 kilowatts, but smaller than 500 kilowatts. So that's pretty dramatic. Even though the total award, it can't be more than 25% of the project cost, but that incentive alone we think is enough to bring that current cost below the cost of electricity for some projects currently. So that said, we don't consider that rebate program here, but what we see when we just look at apples to apples comparison is that in the future, even under the high and low installed cost scenarios, there's not enough reductions to bring those projects back within our electricity rate band. So what does that mean? That means that, potentially if that rebate program does still exist, those projects could be in that competitiveness zone, but clearly we don't know, what that rebate program will look like in 2017. So it could be that rebate, continues to phase out and no longer exists by 2017, in which case the projections that we make would be reflecting what is happening on the ground. So turning to New Jersey, we have seen, an extreme amount of volatility in the SREC market in New Jersey. It has stabilized in recent years and is around $200 a megawatt hour. So what we see right now is that under the 30% ITC, projects are pretty competitive with electricity rates, but not necessarily by a wide margin. And when we look at our future scenarios, our high and low installed cost scenarios, we see that there is still somewhat of a gap there between the projected costs and the electricity rates. So the required incentive SREC price needed to meet that reduction is about $260. So that's not entirely out of line with previous SREC prices in New Jersey, but New Jersey's solar ACP does cap the market at $315. So it could be a little bit close there, depending on what happens with SREC prices and with any incentive programs that might exist in New Jersey. So Delaware, I mentioned in the beginning, but also want to highlight here, Delaware is a little bit different in that systems there bid into an auction and get a fixed price for their SRECs over 10 years, and then after that 10 years, for a second 10-year period, they get $35 per SREC. So you really have some long-term certainty in terms of SREC prices, although that first 10 years could vary year to year. So for when projects are bidding in. So what we see in Delaware is that currently under these assumptions that we use, projects are not within the competitiveness zone, and that they won't be there if there there is a reduction to 10% and under these high and low installed cost scenarios. But we did find that in Delaware, you have some unique situations, and we do know that there was about 60 megawatts of installed capacity in Delaware. So it's not to say that nothing is happening in this market. It's just that the way we take into account future SRECs and incentives doesn't quite match what's happening in the current scenario. And we do see, going forward in the high and low cost scenarios that we need an SREC price of just over $100 in order to be in that competitiveness zone. So that's, $100 per megawatt hour would make a considerable difference here. So in Ohio, we have seen a lot of changes in that market. Most of you or all of you probably know that the governor froze the state's RPS in 2014, which did impact SREC prices and really switch up this market. So another big change was that whereas before half of the solar had to come from in-state, there is now no in-state requirement, which allows Ohio to use SRECs from Pennsylvania or other states that might have lower cost SRECs in order to meet their compliance. Ohio also has pretty low electricity rates, so it does make it harder for projects to compete with those low electricity rates. So what we see currently under the 30% ITC scenario is that projects are not making that competitiveness zone. They won't make that zone under the high and low cost scenarios. So what does that mean for the Ohio market? It could be that projects are not developed in Ohio for carve-out compliance. That the LSEs there are drawing from out-of-state resources in order to meet their solar carve-out. That's one scenario. Another scenario is that we could see SREC prices increase in Ohio if there are projects that are sort of on the margin there. So yeah, this a little bit of a unique case in Ohio as well as Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania also allows out-of-state SRECs. And historically, the market has been pretty oversupplied. So we have seen that SREC prices there are pretty low. They're around $13 or $15 per megawatt hour, and they've trended this way over the past couple of years. So SREC prices in Pennsylvania are pretty different from what we see in Massachusetts or New Jersey, for example. And according to our analysis, the SREC price would have to increase to almost $300 under the future scenarios in order for projects to be economic or in that competitiveness electricity rate zone, which is dramatically different from the $13 that we see currently, and that SACP for solar in Pennsylvania in 2017 is $200. So what does that tell us is that, probably compliance will be met with out-of-state resources in Pennsylvania. That's not to say that we couldn't see projects developed there for carve-out compliance, but the ITC reversion would make it more challenging for those projects to be developed. So last market that we looked at was Washington, D.C., which is I say a unique market, and obviously every market is unique. Washington, D.C. is really unique because of its siting challenges. So there is a limited amount of roof space. There's a large collection of historic buildings that might be unavailable for development. There's also a lot of infrastructure that is already on roofs that might make them just might not allow enough roof space to make solar installation feasible. So given that context, the relatively high solar carve-out we see that currently, projects can be built for less than the electricity price bands that you see there. But those siting challenges do make it difficult. So under these just purely economic scenarios, we do see that project economics under both scenarios would be less than the electricity prices in the future, and that there wouldn't need to be an increase in SREC prices in order for those projects to be competitive. And just one side note here is that we did not have electricity rate data specifically for Washington, D.C., but we used proxy data that is pretty close to it and is pretty similar. So just one caveat on Washington, D.C. there. So just to wrap up everything, we've been through a lot of states, a lot of scenarios. It can be kind of confusing to map this all together. So to conclude here, we present basically the results of our two sections and then an overall sensitivity categorization. So the first column there is the sensitivity to capacity reductions. The second is the sensitivity of project economics, and then the third column is our sort of melding of those two previous columns. So as a result, you see Ohio and Delaware are highly sensitive to the ITC reversion, DC, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, medium sensitivity, and pretty low sensitivity in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and New Jersey. And aside from, this looking at different scenarios and things like that, one of our key conclusions was that state incentives other than SREC really play a critical role in determining the competitiveness of projects. State rebate programs are having a dramatic impact on current installed costs, and if those programs were to go away, as well as having an ITC reversion, that could make a large impact on the solar market. And we also, wanted to note that, compliance obviously is not being met with exclusively the systems that we modeled in SAM. So we modeled a 500 kilowatt system, and obviously other project sizes and even residential systems are being used to meet the solar carve-out. And there are other policies and policy discussions that can impact those different projects. For example, net metering policy discussions or new rate design that we did not take into account here. So this market is moving very quickly, and there are a lot of policy discussions and rate design discussions happening right now that will be in flux for the next 2 years. So that's our summary and conclusions. I have included my contact information here and would encourage you to contact me if you have questions that we don't get to today, or just want to follow up on something that you don't want to ask in a chat window or might require some more detailed conversation. But check out the reports, and I guess, Warren, I'll turn it over to you now for Q&A.
Hey, thanks very much for that good presentation, Jenny. And I do have quite a few questions to pass on, but if folks have others, feel free to write them in. The first is a simple one. At the beginning, you talked about carve-out compliance rate. What did you mean by that?
So the carve-out compliance rate, that is a good question, is the compliance by the load-serving entities or the compliance utilities that was met using SREC. So we don't include in that percentage any compliance that was done through ACPs. So it's a way for us to see, is compliance being met through procuring SRECs, or is it being met by paying ACPs to get a sense of, which market might be short of solar.
Good. The next question, before I ask it, I want to clarify one thing that someone asked about, and that was somebody asked what's GTM, and it's Green Tech Media, and that's a private firm that does research and analysis on clean energy markets. But that's a prelude to the question I want to ask you, Jenny. The projections from GTM and EIA within the Department of Energy are very different, as you point out. Do you have any reason to believe one of those two projections is more likely to be accurate?
So they do, they do include different assumptions, and the assumptions, I think could be scrutinized in either case. And there are also, since we looked at forecasts for our report, additional forecasts have come out. So, it's really hard to tell with these market forecasts, and that's why we did use a high and a low projection, because we don't have a high degree of confidence that actual deployment will be right in the middle of those two scenarios, or will be at the high end or the low end, or even outside of those projections. So I guess that's a long way of saying we include two scenarios because they are a high and a low, and gives us a reasonable sense of what might happen. But I will also say that SIA has, I think last week or the week before, published a new study where they did use GTM, I think, and Bloomberg New Energy Finance, or maybe just one of them. But it's another example scenario of deployment. But for that study, they just assumed that solar carve-outs would be met. So that was sort of their minimum baseline, of where deployment would be. So for each forecast, you really need to look at what are their underlying assumptions, and how do they vary from different forecasts that exist.
Okay. When comparing the state's shortfalls, did you also capture interstate trading, or did you only consider capacity within the region?
So when we are looking at one of the first slides where I outlined percent compliance, that does include out-of-state SRECs that were used for compliance. So when we said 100% compliance for some states, some of that would be coming from out-of-state where it's allowed. In the SAM runs, we're just looking at in-state project economics. So in Pennsylvania, we're modeling a project in Pennsylvania under economic conditions in Pennsylvania to see if that project would be competitive. But I think I highlighted this, but maybe not well enough. Pennsylvania can use out-of-state SRECs. So, given that price difference in Pennsylvania between future installed costs of solar and the electricity rates, it's pretty likely that out-of-state SRECs would be used. So that's sort of how we treated the modeling work. We can't model every scenario, but that gave us a sense of would a project in that state be economical or competitive, given the ITC reversion and our reduction scenarios.
Okay, no, that explains it. Somebody asked, why are the bands for Massachusetts and New Hampshire so different? 18 to 24 cents per kilowatt hour for Massachusetts versus only 12 to 15 cents for New Hampshire.
So yeah, I am not a rates expert, but our ranges, are based on basically taking out the demand charge component. So you might see a larger or smaller band depending on how large that demand charge component is. So I don't know, Warren, if you could speak to that about demand charges in Massachusetts, but just to say that they differ by state and by utility in terms of how much the demand charge makes up of the total electricity bill.
Well, that's a good answer, and that's about as far as I'd be able to take it, so we'll leave it there.
Okay. And if that person wants to send me a note, I can direct you to Travis Lauder, who is an author on this report and has done a lot of work, did the SAM modeling for this report and has done a lot of work on financing issues, so has a better understanding of the nuances of demand charges than I do.
Okay, great. Somebody was questioning whether the way you're using soft costs and balance of system is conflating them and making them seem like the same thing, and maybe that's a function of the SAM inputs, but balance of systems includes hardware and soft cost doesn't. So shouldn't those two terms be distinct?
So that's actually not how we look at the terms or how DOE, Department of Energy, looks at them. They consider the balance of systems to be sort of the non-hardware costs, which is a similar term to soft costs. So we do see both terms used interchangeably. And yeah, what we're getting at here are the things like labor, permitting costs, things like that are not tied to the hardware costs of the system.
Yeah. Well, here's a fundamental question. Somebody's asking, RPSs include more than solar. They include things like wind. How were you able to focus only on solar?
Mm-hmm. So we...
The person's asking about the difference between the carve-outs and the main tiers.
Yeah, it sounds like it. So we only look at states that have a carve-out, which means that there is a set percentage of RPS or of retail sales that has to come from solar. So we isolate that one component as the megawatts or megawatt hours that need to come from solar. That's not to say that in some of these markets you couldn't see solar contributing to the main tier, and we have seen that in some states, though it has been primarily states in the Southwest that have very, very good solar resource and project economics. So just on commercial ITC reversion, and more work could certainly be done to run these scenarios in SAM to understand for residential systems what economics might look like there.
Okay, good. I have one last question, and then I will give you a minute to say anything else you want to say before we close. And the last question somebody wrote in had to do with your analysis for Washington, D.C. It made it seem, looking at the slides, that there was low sensitivity in Washington, but then when you came to your summary slide, it ended up as medium sensitivity.
Yeah, so in Washington, D.C., for project economics, we did see that there was low sensitivity because the SREC prices are so high in Washington, D.C. right now that does make project economics look pretty favorable, even under an ITC reversion. But we wanted to mesh that with our understanding of deployment, which we classify as highly sensitive. So we see that under these deployment or capacity expansion scenarios that there's a lot of capacity that's still needed in Washington, D.C. in order to meet their solar carve-out. So you'll see in that summary table that for D.C. we had high sensitivity to capacity reductions, low sensitivity of project economics, and medium overall. And some of that, is operating in this with the consideration that projects are hard to install in D.C. So it's hard to get rooftop space. There's not a lot of open space to develop non-rooftop projects. So that, that consideration, leads us to believe that, you might see a pretty high SREC price going forward, but it's not clear whether that will be enough to drive deployment to meet the solar carve-out.
Good. Thanks for that explanation. And is there anything else you want to say as famous last words here for this webinar?
Yeah, I guess famous last words. We didn't touch on it a lot in the report, but it's important for state policymakers and folks administering their RPSs to consider the role of state incentives other than SRECs. And we know that those incentives, whether they're rebate programs or have a different structure, really can make an impact on project economics. And the uncertainty around the ITC reversion may lead to developers to push for renewal of those state incentives. So there may be some dramatic considerations over the next couple years between ITC reversion and other incentive policies. So I would just encourage folks to, consider the ITC reversion as they make other policy changes, and consider, the level of uncertainty at the federal level and how that may impact your state programs. So I think I'll leave it at that, and you have a link to the report there as well, so check that out for more detail, but I will leave it at that.
Hey, thanks very much, and I do hope folks, if based on listening to this webinar, will want to go to the report, which does have more information on the methodology, and it makes it easier to follow some of the detailed findings there. It's well worth taking a look at. And Jenny, thanks for your usual clear and articulate presentation, and thanks everybody for attending the webinar, and we hope to see you on future webinars. So enjoy the rest of the day.